On the night of June 17, 1864, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain walked amongst his sleeping soldiers. He couldn't sleep, and he sought to rest his weary mind with a walk. I had a strange feeling that evening, a premonition of coming ill. A dark shadow seemed to brood over me, dark wings folding as it were, and wrapping me in their embrace. The man from Maine had been in many of the most destructive battles of the Civil War, but this feeling was different entirely. The next afternoon, Chamberlain led the 1st Brigade of the 1st Division of the 5th Corps, made up of Pennsylvania troops, against the Confederate Dimmock Line outside of Petersburg. Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia had been pushed back to Richmond and Petersburg, Virginia by Ulysses S. Grant, and this attack was an attempt by Grant to dislodge the Confederates from their stronghold. The hail of lead tore into Chamberlain's brigade. The flag bearers were among the fallen, so the man from Maine charged forward with his sword in one hand and the 5th Corps flag in the other. As Chamberlain approached the enemy's entrenchments, a bullet pierced his right hip and into his groin. He held himself up by leaning himself against the staff of the flag until the blood loss was too much, and he collapsed to his knees. He was immediately taken to the Army hospital, where he believed there was no reason for doctors to tend to him. He was a dead man, he thought. After an excruciating night in pain, Chamberlain found himself alive the next morning. Doctors had removed the bullet and believed him to not survive. After 6 months of recovery, Chamberlain rejoined the Army in time for the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox. Once the war ended, he returned to the civilian life, but was a national hero for his bravery during the entire war, particularly at Little Round Top. He was asked to speak at numerous dedications and veteran encampments. Although he returned to his civilian life, the wound he obtained at Petersburg would follow him until his death. He would make speeches to large crowds, but they would not know that he was in excruciating pain and would remain so until he died. Damage to his urethra remained permanent and stayed constantly infected. Chamberlain was constantly self-conscious about the wound because it leaked urine, and the wound made his reproductive organs unusable. He had surgery to fix the problem in the 1880s, but to no avail. The problem returned, and he was in the same position he was in before the surgery. Some infections kept him incapacitated for days. Over the course of the rest of this video, we will hear examples of how this impacted Chamberlain's life. His wound was invisible to the general public. His clothes concealed any indication that he was wounded. Amputees could not conceal the fact that they lost arms, legs, or other body parts. And those veterans are the ones we think of when we imagine veterans with a disability. However, just concentrating on those individuals ignores a large segment of veterans. Historian Theda Skocpol has identified that 281,881 Union soldiers were wounded and survived the war. Of this number, only 20,802 were amputees. That means that the rest of those wounded possessed wounds or injuries most likely not visible to the general public, and those men made up the majority of veterans. It may be surprising that Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain was listed as totally disabled in his pension documents. However, he did not outwardly show any signs of being disabled. This video does not seek to hide the stories of amputees, but to expand our concept of wounded veterans to include those with invisible wounds, as historian Sarah Handley Cousins would term it. Chamberlain's story highlights the difficulty with which veterans attempted to maneuver normally within societies despite disabilities. Chamberlain concentrated on working diligently as governor, despite the pain. He had a chair in his office to make sitting more comfortable for his injured hips. He also placed a couch in his office so he could lay down and work when sitting upright became too painful. Chamberlain's marriage became strained due to his wound. Before the war, we have evidence that they shared a physical, loving relationship. In late July 1863, we have a letter he wrote to his wife expressing that intimate relationship. He wrote, "You know I am not well yet. That will account for my slight unsoundness of mind and a remark I just made to Colonel Rice about sweet smiling valleys between the soft blue hills. It is a veil of love between the breasts of the mountain. Shall I be forgiven? And yet I have to believe I should have said it to you if you had been here. A soldier is bold, you know." However, most historians infer that a lack of intimacy and marriage difficulties emerged from constant travel, a dive into politics, and his inability to be intimate with his wife. In 1868, Fanny, his wife, accused him publicly of physically and verbally abusing her, as well as denying her a divorce. In his letter to her rebutting this accusation, he denied abusing her and ties his wounds to a source of their troubles. Although they would separate, they would come back together again in the early 1870s. Historian Sarah Hanley Cousins points out that Chamberlain, as well as other veterans with invisible wounds, were overlooked by the public. Patriotic songs like The Empty Sleeve portrayed veterans with amputated limbs as overly patriotic for giving a piece of themselves to the country. It was the amputees who gained most attention from the public, the media, and the government. Amputees were given more money through pensions than men like Chamberlain. This statement is also true for historians who pass over Chamberlain for men with more apparent wounds. After his 1883 surgery to fix the fistula, the pain and infections came back with increasing pain, and in 1892 he applied to the pension office for an increase in money. Fanny had been gradually going blind, and his unsuccessful son Willis was still financially dependent on his father. Because Chamberlain could not prove that his infections were a direct result of the wound, he was denied any increase in pay. It did not help that by the late 1800s the American public had turned their back on the Union War veterans. The public became skeptical of disabled pensioners, particularly those with no physical signs of a disability. This skepticism made its way to the Pension Bureau, making it harder for men like Chamberlain to get an increase in pay. Chamberlain himself would pass away in 1914, resulting from complications stemming from the infection of his war wound. He was a casualty of war. It just took 50 years for him to succumb to the wound. Thank you so much for watching Have History Will Travel. Please share the video to get the word out about it, and I'll see you next week.